So, Legion just got buffed, except they kind of didn't. The PTB is hit, and along with Kaneki, it comes with significant changes to Legion and Xenomorph. Obviously, Xenomorph is the talk of the town with these absolutely ridiculous changes to flame turrets. For what it's worth, I stand by my Xeno-loving brethren in trying to get these changes dialed back. After all, I'm a Skull Merchant main. Of course I understand what you're going through. I mean, do you call this a nerf, this fine little thing? This is not a nerf. I received a bigger nerf than you will ever know. I've had worse bugs than you could ever imagine. And when I close my eyes, I hear more hate messages than anyone could ever be able to count. And do you know what you do with all that pain? Oh, they reverted most of the changes. Well, that kind of kills this bit, doesn't it? Well, I'm glad for them anyway, you know. I just really wanted to do the bit. And yes, before anyone asks, I am using bot gameplay to showcase PTB Legion, because the only idea even worse than waiting for 30 minutes on a PTB queue to play Legion is waiting 30 minutes in a PTB queue to subject 4 other survivors to Legion who are probably just going to DC anyway as soon as they don't get a Kaneki. If I wanted to spend my evening either losing or making everybody hate me because of my character choices, at least Overwatch would give me loot boxes for it. But while Kaneki seems to have been a broadly well-liked addition to the killer roster, and the Xenomorph changes have caused, well, shall we say, heated discussion, talk around the Legion numbers buffs and adjustments have been relatively quiet. Behaviour claimed that these changes came as compensation for the reduced time it takes to mend a deep wound. But if you take a look at it, you'll realise they've basically buffed every number in Legion's power. Faster movement speed, shorter fatigue duration, faster movement during fatigue, shorter power cooldown, longer frenzy duration. In terms of numbers improvements, there's not really many other numbers you could possibly have buffed. And yet if you play it on the PTB, you'll start to realise something. Legion before the PTB buffs was a pretty crappy killer. And despite all the buffs to literally every element of their power, they're still a pretty crappy killer. They don't really feel stronger for it. Normally when a killer gets every single part of their power buffed at once, they feel meaningfully better and will probably climb a few spots in the old tier list. Look at Nemesis or Myers, who got a series of potent number buffs that you can really feel when playing them, especially Nemesis. So why didn't this trick work with Legion? I don't think this is a problem with the buffs themselves, they're definitely welcome, but more of a problem with Legion's power design itself. Which brings me to the thesis of this video. I think Legion is kind of just doomed to suck forever in a way that I don't think any other killer in the game really is. Don't get me wrong, a lot of killers suck, and a fair few of them even suck more than Legion right now. But these killers might be decent someday. Behaviour might have the reason and the capacity to make improvements through buffs or reworks that might actually make them solid killers. But I don't think that can ever happen for Legion. So let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, why the Legion is probably going to suck for the rest of time. Let's start with the simple stuff, what Legion's power actually does. Those who don't know, Legion's power is one of the simplest in Dead by Daylight. Feral Frenzy gives you increased movement speed and allows the killer to vault pallets and windows really fast, at the cost of hiding scratch marks and pools of blood. When you attack a survivor in Feral Frenzy, you get increased lunge range and your stab will inflict a deep wound on the survivor as well as injuring them, even if they're already injured. Stabbing someone in Frenzy will reset the power's duration, give you a chunk of movement speed for your next use of the power, and reveal the killer instinct of every survivor within your terror radius who is not inflicted with a deep wound. Every time you stab someone, this refreshes until your 4th consecutive stab in a single use of your power, which will immediately down the survivor it hits regardless of their health states. It's a simple description for a very simple power. It's one of the most approachable in Dead by Daylight. Find survivor, stab survivor, see more survivor so you can run and stab them too. But it doesn't help you down them almost ever, so you'll have to get the second health state yourself. You can give more or less anyone Legion, and they'll pick up the power relatively quickly, and that's a surefire way to make a killer that's popular to play. The most consistently common killers in the game tend to have powers you can write on a post-it note, or where the complexity in the power comes from the survivor angle or in the background in a way the killer doesn't really have to know about or engage with to play them at a reasonable level of effectiveness. Take Nemesis for example. Nemesis' power description is long as shit, but most of that is just relegated to the syringes or the zombies, which are elements of the power that Nemesis himself doesn't have to personally interact with. It's just stuff that goes on around you most of the time. A really good Nemesis knows how to work with his zombies with the tracking they give and whatnot, but you don't need that to pick up Nemesis. At a baseline level, he's just got a really oppressive and simple to pick up zoning power, and that's all you need to learn to play with. he's got a low skill floor, and more importantly a low floor of understanding. So he's a popular killer to play, and Legion is no different. You might think that a simple power with a low skill floor might have been why Legion's buffs haven't stuck. But being low skill floor didn't stop Nemesis buffs from being very significant, so what's gone wrong with Legion? Why did their buffs fail but Nemesis's buffs succeed? I think the critical issue here is a matter of what the buffs were being piled onto. The reason Nemesis was weak before his buffs and why he got buffed is not the same reason Legion was weak before their buffs and remains weak after the buffs. Nemesis was weak because they weren't particularly good at what they're supposed to do. Nemi's meant to be the archetypical mid-range zoner. The survivors effectively get 3 health states in some of their chases because he has to infect them first, but is offset by the fact that the whip is far more fluid and faster to fire than many of the other mid-range zoning powers like Pyramid Head or Dracula, plus it can break pallets. You're using your power more than those killers because the whip's fluidity gives you more room to do so. But as a trade-off you have to use it more to chew through resources, get your infections and earn the buffs at the range increase and the pallet break. The problem with Nemi is that the juice just wasn't worth the squeeze a lot of the time. It's been too long in tier 1 or especially tier 2, and when you got to tier 3 it often wouldn't even feel that impactful. The 3-hit chase system made his early game even worse since survivors got full distance after being whipped. It just wasn't worth it compared to the other mid-range zoners even with the zombies to back you up. All behaviour had to do was improve that value calculation a bit. Tiering up became easier, the distance survivors got after being tentacled got slashed, and his range was increased so that the power could be used in even more places, doubling down on the fluidity that defines the character. This made Nemesis far more effective at basically everything his power is meant to do. Chew through resources and end chases quickly by using his power as much as possible. And as it turns out, making a killer better at doing that will meaningfully improve their strength. Killers who are good at chases tend to be good killers. What a shocking revelation, truly. But Legion's buffs are different, because Legion was always good at what their power is meant to do. Spread out injuries quickly and efficiently so that the fact you don't have a power for the second health state is offset by how quickly you get the first one. Punish allies for grouping up. Make them waste time mending. That's what Legion is meant to be good at, and while the buffs did definitely make them better at it, they were already one of the best killers, if not the best killer, at doing that already. There are other killers whose powers are balanced around getting one of your health states much more easily than the other one. Plague, Skull Merchant, and to some degree Deathslinger are all better suited to injuring you with the power than they are at downing you with it, and Twins and to some degree Oni are the opposite. Better at downing survivors than they are at injuring them. But no killer is as efficient at shredding through health states as Legion. By the time Plague or Skull Merchant can get one injury with their power, Legion could have injured multiple survivors already and be well into their first proper chase. Legion is not weak because they're bad at what they do. Legion is weak because what they do is not worth doing. Wait a second, did I just quote the Big Bang Theory?
I have never said that you are not good at what you do. It's just that what you do is not worth doing.
Sorry, just give me a second. Alright guys, yeah, sorry about that. I just had to get that off my chest. That's kind of where the charm of Legion's power being extremely simple falls apart. If a power is so simple it becomes one-dimensional, then that one dimension had better be pretty fucking good, because if it's not, then it's basically impossible to make the killer decent. It's what makes Plague a far stronger and easier to balance killer than Legion, despite doing the thing that Legion does worse than they do. She forces players to ration out healing through the fountain system, she has constant tracking and information through her infections, and she occasionally gets Corrupt Purge that lets her carve through entire teams without much effort. Plague's power is always doing something, and create difficult choices for survivors at all stages of the game. So if Plague is ever too weak or too strong, there's lots of areas in which she can be tuned to adjust that. You can sort out her fountain spawns, corrupt purge duration based on infection rates, contamination duration on objects, puke charge rate or cooldown. There's so much you can do to adjust Plague's power if you want to fine tune what she's capable of. To adjust her strength without breaking her. Legion's power being inherently limited by comparison means that is not going to happen. They are measured entirely by how good they are at the one thing they do, but the thing they do just isn't effective. The only way you can make Legion's power effective through buffs alone would be extreme, making Feral Frenzy such an absurdly efficient ability that the limitations of it being useless for the second health state become unimportant. This would probably have to be done by ramping the movement speed up to an insane degree so that Legion would have map coverage, something similar to how Master or Wraith, who can traverse the map on command. But this becomes an issue when you realise the entire counterplay to Feral Frenzy is splitting up. The stab itself is an extended lunge, and the killer gets enhanced vaults during it. There's no real avoiding a Feral Frenzy stab unless you're so far from the Legion when the power starts that you're out of range. The higher you ramp up Legion speed, the less relevant this limitation becomes. If Legion becomes fast enough to consistently use their speed for map coverage, then it becomes almost completely impossible to evade a Frenzy stab. And if splitting up becomes less effective against Legion, then the force stab down suddenly becomes far harder or even impossible to prevent on smaller maps, meaning survivors will find themselves going down to Legion without anything they or anyone else could ever have done to prevent it. The power is one of the worst in the game, but to buff it significantly would require removing most if not all of the counterplay Legion has. And to buff it more safely with smaller adjustments like the ones we just got, won't meaningfully affect the strength of one of the game's weakest killers. So while we're looking at seriously buffing Legion to haul them out of the bottom of C tier, making them better at what they already do is kinda off the table, because you just sort of can't do that. So perhaps the solution here is to give them more options. Make Feral Frenzy more broadly useful, on top of just doing the one thing it does right now. And here's where we have a problem on our hands, because Feral Frenzy is hands down the easiest power in the entire game to use, and making it do more without changing that dynamic is a recipe for disaster. This isn't just speculation though. We've been through a period before where Legion did more with Feral Frenzy and it created one of the worst monsters in Dead by Daylight history that's still whispered in hushed tones today. Original Launch Legion. Old Legion was almost mechanically the same as New Legion. Controlling Feral Frenzy worked in a very similar way. Vault pallets and windows, go fast, long lunge into a stab with a deep wound, except there was an added effect on top of the deep wound. Every time Legion stabbed somebody in Feral Frenzy, their deep wound timer would drop considerably, meaning if you just kept frenzy stabbing them with your power over and over again, they'll just slowly die. That's what Old Legion was, they just followed you around until you died, with zero capacity for the Legion to express their skill, and nothing the survivors could reasonably do to prevent that inevitable death. And it's what happens when you let Feral Frenzy have a lethality component, when you let it do more without requiring more input from the Legion player. I truly don't believe a single release could ever kill Dead by Daylight by itself, but Old Legion came probably the closest any release has ever come to actually killing the game. And even to this day, Old Legion is almost universally considered DBD's worst designed killer ever. Legion's in the state they're in today because behaviour had to salvage what they could from the atrocity they squeezed out in the Darkness Among Us chapter. But as deeply problematic as Old Legion was, I think people need to be reminded sometimes that even in their current state, Legion has inherited a lot of the issues the Old Legion had. Feral Frenzy as an ability is still very light on skill expression and meaningful counterplay. The only difference is that the consequence of that lack of counterplay is a free injury rather than a free down. If anything, that first hit is even freer than it was with Old Legion, because the New Legion is significantly faster in Frenzy, meaning that splitting up is less of a viable counter. You know what? I'm just going to come out and say it. New Legion is a much better design than Old Legion, but that is such an incredibly low bar that I still think Legion is Dead by Daylight's worst killer design. Not because they're the most unfair or the most annoying or because I don't like them, but just because there is nothing there. There is nothing going for them. There's no skill expression, no real gameplay to using their power on either side. There's no strength there, but there's also no room to safely buff them without unleashing the unspeakable one that was sealed away for a goddamn reason. The way I see it, there's only been 2 periods in DBD's history where I think we've had a worse designed killer than Legion was at that time. And that was March to October 2023, which is when pre-rework Chess Merchant was holding games hostage, and December 2023 to March 2024, when Chucky had manual Scamper on command, which, let's be honest, was just Old Legion with check spots anyway. Let me be clear about something here. I'm not making this video because I hate Legion. I don't. There is a pretty significant number of killers in this game I dislike playing and playing against more than Legion. But for most of the problem killers in Dead by Daylight, or the ones that I don't like very much, there's at least some hope that they'll get changed at some point. That there's room in those killers' kits to buff or nerf them while maintaining their identity. polishing up their skill expression and their counterplay, all that jazz, the stuff you'd expect in standard killer maintenance. That can never happen with Legion. You can't make their power meaningfully better at the thing it already does because it's already so good at doing it. But you can't make the power do more things because, well, we don't want Farmer Jones to come back. If every killer was buffed as much as they could safely be buffed, without fundamentally reworking their power, Legion would be the weakest killer in the game, and it's not even close. Because the few killers that are already worse than them, like Trapper and Skull Merchant, have kits that have room to get buffed. If John Behaviour woke up one morning and thought, damn, I really want to buff Trapper and Skull Merchant, he could go in and do that. Make adjustments, increase numbers, tweak the characters in ways that would meaningfully affect their strength, without just deleting their power and replacing it with a new one. Yeah, they're not going to delete Merchant's power and just give her a brand new one, right? Right? I've made a video before talking about how I would buff DBD struggling trap killers, so if you're interested in learning about that, then do take a look at it. But Legion just can't be buffed, or at least not in a way that will translate into a meaningful increase in strength without them just breaking the game, just like old Legion did. The only alternative, therefore, is to do what Behaviour has been doing with Legion since they came out, and that has been token buffs. Incremental number adjustments that just smooth out the experience of playing the killer while being safe enough to not risk breaking the killer. But if that's the approach we have to take, the killer is pretty much doomed to be bad forever. It sucks, but that's the way it's got to be. You'd think then that the logical conclusion of a killer whose design condemns them to be the bottom of every tier list ever would be a rework. But here's the thing, because Behaviour will almost certainly never rework Legion again. A lot of killers have been reworked throughout DBD's history. Leatherface, Twins, Doctor, Knight, Trickster. A few killers like Billy, Sadako, Freddy, and soon-to-be Skull Merchant even got reworked twice. And most of the time a killer gets reworked, it's because of a lack of popularity on one side or another. Maybe it's because they're so cripplingly weak that nobody wants to play them, and they need a rework to bring them up to standards of modern killer design, like Bubba or Freddy. Maybe it's because their gameplay is too demanding, too oppressive, or just too plain annoying for the survivors to go against, so they get reworked for that reason. That's what happened to Knight, Sadako, and Skull Merchant. Sometimes a killer just gets reworked because Behaviour sees a niche killer and wants the pick rate to go up without any considerations as to why the killer is the way they are. Yeah, that's why the abomination that was the Twins rework happened. But Legion has the ultimate shield protecting them from a future rework. They are, and always have been, really popular killers. According to Nightlight, they've basically always been in the top 10 most picked killers at any given time. They have plenty of dedicated fans among content creators, and while it's not too often that you hear survivor players who love going against Legion, Legion aren't bemoaned in the same way that the truly hated killers are. Probably because they are very weak, and the gameplay against them is very simple. Split up to avoid chain stabs, and then playing as an M1 killer with no power. It's not exactly challenging to understand. At the end of the day, a lot of Dead by Daylight players, especially on the more casual end of the spectrum, like to run and stab, and strong or not, well designed or not, Legion can provide that experience like no other killer can. That's the only insulation Legion has against getting the Skull Merchant or Freddy treatment. The minute the community turns on Legion, and that loyal player base of run and stab enjoyers starts to dry up, that's when the possibility of a full rework of Legion is something that Behaviour might start considering. But I don't think that's going to happen. There's way more problematic or niche killers they'll want to address first before going anywhere near one of their most played, and therefore most marketable and lucrative killers. Mark my words right here, right now, because I'm certain Behaviour is going to try reworking Twins again before they ever touch Legion, because their pick rate is too low, and they're going to cock it up just as badly on the second time as they did on the first time. Just throwing that out there. But a recent addition to the game means Legion's popularity is by no means secured for the future. Perhaps for the first time in this game's history, the Canadian teenagers with asbos and small knives might have some competition in the power department. When the new killer Kaneki hit the PTB, the power that his was most commonly compared to was Legion's. Kaneki can get the first hit in a jiffy, spread deep wounds, and jump between survivors very easily, but doesn't have the authority to confirm a down without a bit of extra legwork, which is very similar on paper to Feral Frenzy. But Kaneki has several distinct strengths that Legion doesn't. While Feral Frenzy is pretty anemic as a tool for map traversal, Kaneki has some of the best traversal in the game, on par with Blight and Hillbilly. He's also not as helpless once the first hit is applied. He can slide around a tile, cancel his dashes early, or body block tile resources so he can sneak in an M1 for the down. Even after the fatigue buffs they just got, Legion can't do this effectively. The ability to spread chain stabs is limited by the survivor's ability to hold W in a straight line away from the killer and run you out of power. Once they've done that and started committing to a tile while injured, you straight up just don't do anything that a basic M1 couldn't. Legion's gameplay fantasy is juggling survivor teams by forcing them into a loop of splitting up to avoid a snowball, but grouping back up to reset safely when they have to. But Kaneki actually has the strength and map control to fulfill that fantasy more completely. For a higher skill floor, Kaneki offers basically everything that Legion does and more, but unlike Plague, does it in a similar way to Legion. So if Kaneki really catches on among a large audience of killer players, I can see Legion's popularity nosediving, as they move on to the new edgy anime boy on the block. Don't get me wrong, Legion's simplicity relative to Kaneki and other non-gameplay facets like the cosmetics and music will definitely allow Legion to sustain a player base, even if Kaneki hoovers up a lot of Legion players. People have poured blood points, eerie shards, add-ons, prestige levels into Legion for years. That sunk cost fallacy is going to be hard to break. And that's ignoring the real money that Legion players spend every 2 weeks when a new Susie skin comes out. I don't think they're ever going to reach that twin-style 1%-ish pick rate threshold of killers that just nobody plays at all. But the fewer people there are sticking with Legion because Spicy Legion has captured their interest, the higher chance that popularity that keeps Legion from being comprehensively reworked stops being a factor, and behaviour might start to consider more comprehensive changes. Aside from the popularity itself, there is a second critical redeeming trait that Legion has I'll be covering later, but before I do, I want to make something clear. I am not inherently opposed to killers having low skill floors. The overwhelming majority of this game's players are on the newer or more casual end of the scale, and having a large amount of fun and accessible killers that you can pick up easily is good for that. But just because a killer has a low skill floor that anybody can get into, doesn't necessarily mean that they are good for new players to play though, at least not in my opinion. I believe a good character for beginners is one with a low skill floor, yes, but they also probably need to get you into good habits. Get you learning the ins and outs of the game through a relatively normal gameplay loop that teaches you transferable skills for other killers and gets better alongside you as you become more experienced at Dead by Daylight. In my opinion, Doctor is the perfect example of a killer like this. He's definitely one of the more approachable killers in the game with a power that's easy to understand, but he teaches you a lot of transferable skills and good habits that will age well as you get better at the game. Most chase powers require you to engage with a 50-50 of chasers. Will the survivor drop or will they greed? And Doctor makes that choice the entire point of using his shock therapy. So if you learn to use shock therapy correctly, you'll be able to move on to zoners or ranged killers or whatever with that knowledge already baked into you from playing Doctor. He's also got tracking, which is nice for new players because hiding survivors are some of the hardest obstacles for new players to overcome. But you have to know when to use it, and it'll gradually teach you about survivor macro play and positioning as you get into the habit of using Static Blast when you need it. Doctor teaches you every part of the game's fundamentals, from M1 chases to zoning with your power to survivor tracking without you even realising you're learning it. And it works with almost every perk too, so whatever teachables you'll want to pick up first, Doctor can probably use it better than most killers. Let's compare this to Legion. Legion gets you learning M1 fundamentals because your power won't help you get the down, but other than that you don't really learn anything from playing Legion as you get better at the game. You don't learn anything mechanically since Frenzy is just a long lunge at the end of the day, and it teaches you to only use your power when it's absolutely guaranteed to get that health state. You're punished for using it against players who are already injured. The correct play if your power can't get you a free health state is just to bloodlust a survivor to death, which isn't something I think you should be encouraged to do. You don't learn anything from playing Legion that you couldn't learn from just any other M1 killer. So while Legion might be good for casual or newer killer players in terms of getting results, they're a pretty crappy killer in terms of helping casual or newer killer players get better, at least when compared to a lot of the other options out there. So, at least from where I'm standing, there's kind of a lot wrong with Legion. They're a cripplingly weak killer who can't be meaningfully buffed, are too popular to ever get reworked, and don't even provide a valuable function to new players that other killers don't do better. But let's look at it another way. How much does any of what I'm saying here matter? The killer sucks. The killer will always suck. That is an inevitability of their design, and yet everyone loves them anyway. Legion is popular because at the end of the day, a lot of people just like running and stabbing, and if there's a way that a killer can give them that without ruining the game for everybody else, there's no real harm in Legion existing. At least to me they're pretty bland, but bland is not damaging. And recent events have finally given Legion a niche that they excel in after all this time. Because let me tell you something, 2v8 Legion is a whole different beast. 2v8 Legion works in a very similar way to current Legion, but they have a longer frenzy duration and get a maximum of 8 stabs for their down rather than 4. And this makes them surprisingly well suited to 2v8 support killer role that no other killer except maybe Trapper can occupy. Working with another killer allows Legion's strengths of forcing survivors to scatter and spreading injuries to be capitalised on by another killer who cleans up after them. The larger survivor team and AoE team skills make survivors grouping up inevitable, something that Legion can counter. Once they get a few stabs in, they end up moving fast enough to travel across 2v8's gigantic maps, and if your teammate cages someone and they get uncaged while you're still in your frenzy, that's basically 2 free stabs to add to your chain, one for the person on the hook and one for the person who unhooks them. So many people felt that 2v8 Legion was far more fun than 1v4 Legion could ever be. Maybe this is where the killer can find their niche beyond just being, plague without a soul. Besides, the ultimate design focus of 2v8 is towards a more casual match style anyway. Legion's the ultimate killer for casual, chill, music and subway surfers in chase gameplay, so they'd naturally be better suited to that mode regardless. So, where does this leave us? Legion is an oddity that I think DBD players have kind of taken for granted over the years. If they released today, they'd be absolutely lambasted for being a one-dimensional slice of white bread with a depth of a puddle. But between their incredibly bad release and the snowballing fanbase of players who just value the simple things in Dead by Daylight, they've weaved their way into many players' hearts despite everything railing against them. Maybe Legion will never be a good killer, but as long as the people who enjoy them still can, maybe that's okay. And if not, well, there's always the next Susie skin. That's all I really have to say on the topic of Legion. I've had this video as something I wanted to do for a little while now, but the Legion buffs gave me a really nice excuse to. Do you guys want to see a Legion rework, or are you happy with the direction the power is broadly going in right now? Let me know what you think. But before we go anywhere, I just want to say a special thank you to all my wonderful patrons. I've just moved into a new place and sorting everything out, and you guys do not realise how much of a lifeline you are right now. If you want to get access to my videos a day early, plus a bunch of other cool stuff, then you can sign up using the link in the description. Thank you everybody, and I'll see you in the next video. Ta-ta for now.